My entire family, both parents, my sister, my brother-in-law, and the aunt who'd promised to be my character witness, chose a week-long anniversary trip over showing up to the hearing that would decide whether I kept custody of my own daughter. 3 weeks later, my sister called asking if I could watch her kids for a week, unpaid, while she and her husband took another trip. My name is Autoline, and I want to walk you through exactly how a family ranks a custody hearing against a vacation, and what happens when they come back needing something from the daughter they left standing alone in a courthouse hallway. This story does not slow down. Stay with me. Fast context, because the pace only accelerates from here. I'm the younger of two daughters. My older sister, Winifred, has always occupied a specific, familiar position in our family, the one whose life, from as far back as I can remember, generated a particular kind of coordinated, enthusiastic family attention that mine mostly didn't. Not through any dramatic unfairness exactly, just through some long-established gravitational pull I'd mostly learned to live around rather than directly confront. I went through a difficult divorce about 2 years before this story starts, from my daughter Priska's father, a split that was, I want to be honest, genuinely contentious in ways that eventually required a formal custody hearing to resolve. Not because I'd done anything that put my daughter at risk, but because my ex-husband, following the divorce, had begun making a series of increasingly aggressive claims about my fitness as a parent that my attorney and I both needed to formally, legally, counter with evidence and witness testimony. I want to be clear about how significant this hearing actually was, because I think it matters to understanding the full weight of what happened. This wasn't a minor scheduling formality. This was the actual, formal legal proceeding that would determine my daughter's living arrangements, my custody rights, the entire structural shape of the rest of both our lives. My attorney had specifically recommended I bring character witnesses, family members who could speak to my parenting, my stability, my home environment, and both my parents and Winifred had, months in advance, when the hearing date was first confirmed, agreed to be present and, in my mother's and Winifred's cases specifically, to provide brief testimony. Winifred and her husband Bertrand announced, roughly 6 weeks before the hearing, that they'd booked a milestone anniversary trip, their 10th, for the exact week the hearing had already been scheduled and confirmed for months. I want to be precise about the timeline here, because it matters enormously. The hearing date had been locked in first, communicated to the entire family first, months before Winifred's trip was ever booked. I want to describe what happened when I raised this conflict, because it set the tone for everything that followed. I called my mother, gently, pointing out the overlap, assuming, the way I imagine most people would assume given the relative stakes involved, that a vacation would obviously, easily be moved around a custody hearing that would determine my daughter's future. "Oh, that's frustrating timing," my mother said. "But Winifred and Bertrand have been planning this trip for months, and it's such a big anniversary. I'm sure the hearing will be fine without all of us there. You'll have your attorney, right?" I want to sit with that response for a moment, because I think it tells you almost everything you need to know about how the following weeks unfolded. Not, "Let me talk to Winifred about the dates." Not, "Of course we'll be there for something this important." A logistics-focused reassurance about my attorney's presence, treated as an adequate substitute for the actual family support I'd specifically, formally requested months in advance. I want to describe the actual day of the hearing, because I think it matters to understanding the full weight of what happened. I stood in the courthouse hallway that morning, waiting for a hearing that would determine my daughter's future, and I want to tell you honestly that I had, right up until the actual morning, held on to some small, quiet hope that at least one member of my family would decide, at the last minute, that this specific moment outweighed a vacation. Not one of them did. I went into that hearing with only my attorney and my closest friend, Delphine, who had rearranged her own work schedule specifically to be there once she learned my family wasn't coming. I want to describe what I found out afterward, because it compounds the entire situation in a way that I think matters. I learned, through photos my mother posted to social media that same afternoon, that the entire family, my parents, Winifred, Bertrand, had spent that exact morning on a boat excursion, part of the anniversary trip, smiling in matching sunglasses, captioned with something celebratory about 10 wonderful years. I won the hearing, ultimately. My attorney's preparation and Delphine's testimony about my parenting and stability were, thankfully, more than sufficient, and my custody arrangement remained fully intact. But I want to be honest that winning did not, in any way, soften the specific, particular loneliness of standing in that hallway that morning, knowing that every single member of my own family had, weeks in advance, made a deliberate, informed choice to prioritize a vacation over the most significant legal proceeding of my adult life. I want to tell you what I did in the immediate aftermath, because I think it matters to how the rest of this story unfolds. I didn't say anything dramatic in the moment. I was, quite honestly, too exhausted and relieved by the actual outcome to have the emotional bandwidth for a confrontation right away. But I want to be honest that something in me shifted, quietly and permanently, standing in that hallway watching those vacation photos load on my phone. 3 weeks later, once Winifred and Bertrand were back from their trip, Winifred called. I want to describe the tone of that call carefully, because it was, in almost every respect, completely ordinary. Cheerful, casual, carrying no acknowledgement whatsoever of the preceding weeks, as though the hearing, the trip, and everything about how those two events had been prioritized against each other had simply never happened. Hey, so, Bertrand and I found this amazing last-minute deal for a couple's retreat next month, she said. We were hoping you could watch the kids for us, just for the week. You're so good with them, and it would really help us out. I want to describe the specific detail that made this request land the way it did. Not just watching her kids for a week, unpaid, but doing so while I was, myself, still actively managing the aftermath of a custody hearing she hadn't shown up for, still working through my own daughter's adjustment to the finalized arrangement, still, if I'm honest, processing the specific loneliness of that entire month largely alone. You want me to watch your kids for a week, unpaid, I said. 3 weeks after you skipped my custody hearing for your anniversary trip. There was a pause, the specific pause of someone genuinely not having connected those two things until I said them out loud together. This isn't really related to that, she said. This is just about needing childcare for a trip we've been wanting to take. I thought, since you're already home with Prisco a lot anyway, it might be an easy way to help out. I want to describe what happened over the following conversation, because it revealed, more clearly than almost anything else in this entire story, exactly how my family had processed, or, more accurately, failed to process at all, what they'd actually done a month earlier. When I raised the hearing directly, explaining that I genuinely could not separate the two things, that being asked for a significant, unpaid favor so soon after being so completely deprioritized during the most important legal proceeding of my life felt, to me, like a continuation of the exact same pattern rather than an unrelated request. Winifred's response was one of the most clarifying moments of this entire ordeal. I don't understand why you're still upset about this, she said. You won, didn't you? Everything worked out fine. I don't see why we need to keep bringing it up. You won, didn't you? I want to sit with that phrase for a moment, because I think it's the specific detail that, once I fully absorbed it, reframed my entire understanding not just of that single hearing, but of a much longer pattern I'd apparently been living inside for most of my adult life, without fully naming it. The actual legal outcome of my hearing had, apparently, retroactively determined how seriously my family believed they needed to have treated it in the moment, as though winning meant the absence hadn't really mattered, rather than understanding that the outcome was, at the time of their decision to book a vacation instead, genuinely uncertain. And they had chosen a trip over showing up for me regardless of how it eventually turned out. I declined to watch the kids. I want to be honest that this was, in some ways, one of the more difficult boundaries I've ever set with my family, because it required me to sit directly with Winifred's clear disappointment and confusion, holding firm against years of learned instinct to simply accommodate what my family wanted, the way I'd apparently done, quietly, for most of my life. I want to tell you about the weeks that followed, because they escalated in ways I genuinely did not expect. Winifred, apparently frustrated by my refusal, brought the situation to our parents, framing it, according to what I heard secondhand from a cousin who reached out privately, uncomfortable with how the whole thing was being characterized, as me holding a grudge and punishing the kids over what she described to others as a scheduling thing that got blown out of proportion, especially since everything worked out fine in the end. I want to describe the conversation I eventually had with my mother directly, because it was, in some ways, the most important one of this entire story. I asked her, plainly, whether she had ever, at any point in the 6 weeks leading up to the hearing, considered talking to Winifred about moving the trip once she learned it directly conflicted with a custody hearing that had been scheduled and confirmed months earlier. Her answer, delivered with what I could tell was genuine, if belated, discomfort, was one I've turned over many times since. I didn't want to be the one to ask her to give up something she'd been looking forward to, she said. And honestly, I figured you'd manage fine either way. You always seem to handle these kinds of things so capably on your own. You always seem to handle these kinds of things so capably on your own. Another version of the same underlying assumption, from a different family member, stated plainly within the same difficult stretch of weeks, and I want to be honest that hearing it articulated so clearly was, in its own way, almost more clarifying than the original hearing day itself. My entire family, it seemed, had built an unspoken but consistent understanding of me as the daughter whose most significant, high-stakes moments could be safely deprioritized, precisely because I had, for years, made it easy for them to believe exactly that. I want to tell you what I did next, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most, even though it's less dramatic than the initial confrontation. I didn't cut my family off entirely. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's sometimes an expectation, in stories like this, that the only meaningful response to this kind of pattern is complete estrangement, and that's not the choice I ultimately made, at least not immediately. What I did instead was significantly, deliberately restructure the terms of my relationship with almost everyone involved. A firm, clearly communicated policy going forward that unpaid childcare requests would need to be reciprocal rather than one-directional, considerably clearer boundaries around what kind of family support I was willing to keep providing without acknowledgement, and a new, explicit expectation, stated directly to my parents and Winifred, that showing up for major life events in this family needed to become a consistent, two-way commitment, applied equally regardless of whose milestone happened to be more conventionally celebratory in the moment. I want to be honest that this shift did not go smoothly or immediately. There were several more difficult conversations over the following months, moments where old patterns tried to reassert themselves, family gatherings where I could feel the specific, uncomfortable tension of people recalibrating around a version of me that no longer automatically absorbed things the way I always had before. I want to tell you about Priska specifically because I think her adjustment during this same period matters to the full picture. I want to be honest that navigating a fresh custody arrangement while simultaneously renegotiating fundamental dynamics with my extended family was, in many ways, more exhausting than either challenge would have been entirely on its own, and I'm grateful, in hindsight, that I had Delphine's consistent, reliable support to lean on through both processes at once, given how little my own family had shown up for either. I started therapy about 2 months after the hearing, once the immediate legal resolution had settled enough to leave room for the deeper processing my therapist and I both recognized was needed. She has helped me understand that what happened wasn't really, at its core, about a single scheduling conflict, however painful that conflict was in the moment. It was about a long-established, largely unspoken family pattern finally becoming impossible to ignore or rationalize away, one that required not just processing that specific hearing day, but genuinely reevaluating years of smaller, similar moments I'd previously absorbed without fully naming them for what they actually were. I think, more than anything, about standing in that courthouse hallway that morning, watching vacation photos load on my phone hours later, and how completely, silently I might have continued absorbing that exact pattern indefinitely, had Winifred's phone call 3 weeks later not arrived with such stark, almost absurd timing, a request that, however unintentionally, laid the entire underlying dynamic out so plainly that I genuinely could not continue pretending not to see it. It's been just over a year now. My mother said something to me about 7 months after everything happened that I still think about often, sitting at her own kitchen table, a conversation that felt, finally, like genuine reckoning rather than defensive minimizing. She said, "I don't think we ever really thought about what it cost you, being the one we could always count on to handle things without us. I think we just got used to it being easy, and I'm sorry it took you finally saying no to something for us to actually see that easy isn't the same thing as fair." I didn't fully believe her sincerity at the time. I want to be honest that trust, once specifically eroded this way, doesn't rebuild instantly just because someone finally says the right words. I believe it more now, watching the actual, sustained pattern of behavior that has followed that conversation, including, notably, my entire family rearranging an upcoming holiday gathering months later around a follow-up mediation date I hadn't even had to ask them to accommodate. If you've ever discovered, through some specific, undeniable moment, that your family had quietly built an entire dynamic around your willingness to be endlessly capable and self-sufficient, and had to decide, for the first time, what happens when you finally stop being quite so endlessly self-sufficient, I want to hear about it. I think there's something important about naming these long, slow-building patterns clearly, because they rarely announce themselves as starkly as a missed custody hearing followed by a babysitting request does. And sometimes it takes exactly that kind of unmistakable moment to finally see a pattern you'd been living inside for years without fully naming it. One empty courthouse hallway, one phone call 3 weeks later. That's all it took to finally understand exactly where I'd been ranked in my own family, and exactly how long I'd been quietly, willingly accepting it.